children, Miss Bowler here for story time. We're going to continue reading George's Marvellous Medicine. Today we're at the chapter called Marvellous Medicine, number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George and Mr. Cranky, watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into a giant saucepan. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. "You'll never get it right," said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you just don't have to have the same things, but you have to do exactly the same amounts of things. And how can you possibly do that? "You keep out of this," cried Mr. Cranky. "We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You'll see if we haven't." This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed him more slowly. "You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this," she said. "Dish it out, George," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give a spoonful to that one over there." He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held the spoon with the new medicine on it. "Chick, chick, chick," he said. "Try some of this." The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. It went peck. "Ouch!" it said. Then this funny whistling noise came out of its beak. "Watch it grow," cried Mr. Cranky. "Don't be too sure," said Mrs. Cranky. "Why is it whistling like that?" And there they are watching him. So they've given him the medicine and he's whistling now. "Keep quiet, woman," cried Mr. Cranky. "Give it a chance." They stood there staring at the brown hen. It was getting smaller. George said, "Look at it, Dad, it's shrinking." And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much that it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Goodbye, Grandma. "There's still something you've left out," Mr. Cranky said. "I can't think what it could be," said George. "Give it up," said Mrs. Cranky. "Pack it in, you'll never get it right." Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn, so a bit cross, a bit fed up, because he really wants to make all these giant animals and make lots of money. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in his hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking away slowly. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard from her enormous height. She glared down at the 3 people below her and shouted, "What's going on round here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice. But I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," shouted Grandma. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. There she is, peering down. Oh, I think Grandma looks scarier like that, and she's big. Very much like tea. "Ho-ho!" she cried. "Ha-ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think about to bring your poor old Grandma one. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," said George, "that isn't." "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," she shouted. "My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "Hand it over, George." "No, Grandma," cried George, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's marvellous." "Everything George's is round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." Oh dear. Look, she's snatched the cup and she's about to drink it. What's going to happen? She snatched the cup out of George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, cried the other two. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. So look, there's George and his parents shouting, and there is Grandma, and look, she's just sipped the tea. She's got smoke coming out of her ears. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've drunk 50 doses of George's marvellous medicine, number 4. And now look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen. But Grandma didn't hear her. Great clouds of steam were pouring out of her mouth and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. That means she thinks she's going to die. I didn't do anything, said Mr. Cranky. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth, the nose and ears and the whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, said Mr. Cranky. She's going to blow up, said Mrs. Cranky. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, shouted Mr. Cranky. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of her skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and the shrill it hurt his ears. Call the fire brigade! Call the fire brigade, called Mrs. Cranky. Call the police! Man the hose pipes! Too late, Mr. Cranky said, looking pleased. Grandma shrieked. Mother! Cried Mrs. Cranky. Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of 1. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky, that's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. So I'll show you the pictures. So as you can see, there's Grandma with the steam coming out of her ears. And then, there she is, no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul, furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and then suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going. She's still going. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, said Mrs. Cranky. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each other and pull, Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then... Oh no, look. Can't see her. Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely. Oh no, she's disappeared, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone?" Where have you got to? And how can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?"
"Yes," said Mr. Cranky, "she most certainly was."
George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very few tips of his fingers and the edge of the magic world. And there's George. And that's the end of the story. So Grandma disappeared.